Greetings. My name is Luca Castellani, and I work at the Secretariat of the United Nations Commission on International Trade Law, or UNCITRAL. I am glad to discuss with you today an introduction to the law of electronic transactions, and in particular, to discuss issues relating to electronic documents and electronic signatures. After a general introduction to the law of digital trade, we will see what are the main features of the law of electronic transactions. We will see also what are the main issues with electronic signatures, including what are the policy options. We will then move to review existing UNCITRAL texts and their main features. And finally, I would like to share certain considerations on the interaction between free trade agreements and UNCITRAL texts. First of all, what is the broader picture for the digital economy? Nowadays, we can safely say that all trade is digital. Electronic communications are in fact used in all business sectors all the time and everywhere. And I can say that there is no enterprise, no business person, no matter how small the business is, that can do away with any form of electronic communication whatsoever. In one way or the other, there must be some use of electronic means. In fact, the focus has shifted in the last years from the ability to communicate remotely and anytime to the ability to exchange data, reuse it, and analyze it. We have increasingly seen comments on the importance of data, the data economy, the fourth industrial revolution. We really see how data is used, for instance, to fuel artificial intelligence application. So in that respect, there is indeed a shift in the focus. We also see that many countries desire to engage and successfully develop digital trade strategies, but not all of them are equally successful. Experience shows that engagement in digital trade requires some coherent policy decisions, robust technical infrastructure that would actually support the demand for connectivity. Engagement of the private sector, because historically it is the private sector that develops the various solutions and that is able to support and promote progressive digitization. And then we need, of course, an adequate legal environment. And here I would like already to stress that there is a need to find a right balance between what we call enabling laws and the regulations. The enabling laws, typically represented by UNCITRAL texts, are those laws that want to promote, support, facilitate electronic exchanges, including by addressing some obstacles that could arise from existing texts. Regulations, on the other hand, they set some requirements, some conditions that must be met so that electronic exchanges can take place, for instance, safely, or that different interests are taken in equal consideration. When we look at the adequate legal environment, we know that law reform based on international standards is preferable to finding local solutions. And this in part because digital trade is inherently cross-border. In particular, when we want to focus on these international exchanges, we have to pay attention about the principle of technology neutrality that we will see soon, and its interaction with technical interoperability, which is the ability to actually exchange information between different applications, different software, different websites, for instance. Digital trade law is a very broad field, but of course it is relevant for a number of existing legal branches. For instance, for contracts, dispute resolution, but it is also relevant for specific fields such as transport, banking and finance, so on and so forth. So on the one hand, we have digital trade law as a cross-cutting issue. On the other hand, we have digital trade law itself made of different components. We can identify four main ones: the law of e-transactions and e-signatures, which is the focus of our discussion today. Data privacy and protection, of course, also very important. Cybercrime, consumer protection. And to the side of these, and equally important, we find payments law and intellectual property rights. Both of them extremely relevant for digital trade. Payments themselves are mostly in electronic form, and intellectual property rights increasingly covering issues that arise from online exchanges. In all of these cases, it's very interesting to note that actually there are uniform models, such as model laws and treaties, which promote legal harmonization. And this is understandable since, as we mentioned before, there is an inherent cross-border element of electronic transactions. At the same time, these different areas are not the same. Electronic transactions and electronic signatures are typically enabling laws, self-executing, while data privacy and protection, but also cybercrime, also consumer protection are regulations. So these are requirements that need to be met. And as such, their respect, their compliance may be delegated to some dedicated bodies, some dedicated authorities. If we focus on e-transactions and e-signatures law, we find that this is a foundational law that, first of all, gives legal recognition to the use of electronic means, and then removes obstacles arising from existing legislation. It does apply to a very large number of cases, such as emails, instant messaging, SMS. These are, of course, ways of directly communicating, but also websites and e-commerce platforms, for instance. So apparently more complex applications, but nevertheless rely on the same basic rules for electronic transactions. As it is so fundamentally important, we are not surprised to see that more than 80% of the states have already adopted it. And you can find information on the status of each country in the cyber law tracker that is made available by the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. We have a global model for electronic transactions and electronic signatures law, which is the one prepared by UNCITRAL. This has certain features. It is technology neutral, so it promotes interoperability. As we will see, it does not intend to modify existing law, and it promotes global integration. And then we have also regional models, sometimes based on the same general principles, but sometimes not. Sometimes they are more technology specific. Sometimes we want to promote the regional use of certain standards because it is possible to set mutual recognition of those standards. However, one has to be very careful in that regard, because it is possible that by promoting the creation of a regional digital island, then we will miss out on global connectivity. And as I said before, digital trade is inherently global. This could be a problem for those regions that are left out. In itself, e-transactions and e-signatures law it is quite simple. It establishes some general principles and a limited number of provisions, for instance, with respect to contracts in electronic form. What is really important is that, in general, contract law is not amended. Contract law, of course, foresees freedom of form, but then foresees also some form requirements. For instance, a contract can be in writing, can be signed. The electronic form is one of those forms, one of the possible forms. and it does not demand the development of a special set of rules, which may be difficult to apply, including when a contract actually is a hybrid, half, for instance, on paper and half electronic. So we do not recommend, UNCITRAL does not recommend the adoption of a special set of rules for contracts in electronic form. General contract law should apply, but of course sometimes may need some adjustment. For instance, when it comes to determining the place of dispatch and receipt of a communication, which is easier done on paper, or let's say there is more familiarity with the rules that apply to paper than with the rules that apply electronically. Electronic transactions and electronic signatures law is typically firstly adopted at the national level, but there is some increasing awareness of the fact that there is a need also to have appropriate rules at the international level. And therefore, now there is increasing work in that space, including with regard to free trade and regional trade agreements. What we have learned at UNCITRAL is that legislation should indeed establish the legal status and the legal validity of electronic transactions, increase legal predictability and certainty. When it comes to e-transactions and e-signature, legislation should facilitate, remove existing obstacles instead of regulating and setting new requirements for electronic transactions. And then, as I mentioned before, it should adapt the existing legal requirements, for instance, in contract law, to online transactions. In order to achieve that, UNCITRAL has identified 3 principles which are now broadly accepted, not only in the more than 100 states that have adopted UNCITRAL text, but also in other states: non-discrimination, functional equivalence, and technology neutrality. And then it also gives the possibility, especially when it comes to commercial transactions, for the parties to adjust on the basis of party autonomy these rules to their needs. What about electronic documents? Electronic documents is a notion that typically does not appear in UNCITRAL texts, but it is there. How? It is there because electronic communications that contain the required information, they constitute commercial documents in electronic form. Now, some of these commercial documents, actually, they may have special form requirements. They may need to be signed, they need to be in writing, even they need to be notarized in certain cases. And there are rules, in especially the principle of functional equivalence will help us in addressing these form requirements. But electronic documents may also go beyond what is already there. That is to say, for instance, they may incorporate dynamic information originating from oracles. This is the Internet of Things. This is something that obviously is not possible to do on paper. Or they even be in full or in part automated, which means this is the issue of smart contracts. They can perform based on scripts, on programming. They can perform certain functions. They can react to certain conditions. Of course, this is based on what the programmer instructs the software to do. But of course, we see increasingly automation in part or in full. This is something that needs to be discussed in depth. So the principle of non-discrimination. This is quite simple. It gives a legal effect, legal recognition to electronic exchanges. So for instance, with respect to communications, the principle says that a communication shall not be denied validity only because it is in electronic form. So it may, of course, be denied validity for different reasons. But of itself, the electronic form is not a sufficient reason. In reality, I must add that when it comes to electronic transactions with public entities, usually the law requires additional conditions. But that is not the case for transactions between private parties or between a business person and a consumer. Here we see some examples of these provisions. Article 5 and 5bis of UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Commerce reads exactly like that. Information shall not be denied legal effect, validity, or enforceability solely because it is in the form of a data message or it is incorporated by reference. The notion of data message itself is very broad, and it has to do with information in electronic, magnetic, optic, or similar form. So it is as technology neutral as possible. Similarly, Article 9 of the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Commerce has a rule on legal recognition of data messages with respect to evidence, so that they should not be denied admissibility just because of their electronic form. Again, they could be denied because of other reasons because the origin is unclear. So the second principle is functional equivalence, and this is something really important here. The core issue is the form requirement. So as I said before, contract law or the parties themselves may set some form requirements, like the exchanges should be in writing, they should be signed, that the document should be original or authentic, and so on and so forth. Now, these are form requirements that typically have been developed for a paper-based environment. And therefore, how to transpose them online is the issue. And the solution that UNCITRAL has suggested, and that has been very successful, is not to look at the procedure or the method itself, but to look at the goal that is pursued by asking that form requirement. So the question is, what is the function? For instance, when it comes to writing, what is the reason why the law asks for a document to be in writing? And the reason is because there is the need to have a future reference. There is the need to access that information in the future, so that we can go back and see what was decided, so that we don't have any dispute on what was the actual content of the document. So Article 6 of the UNCITRAL Model Law on Electronic Commerce, for instance, says where the law requires information to be in writing, that requirement is met by a data message if the information contained in the data message is accessible so as to be usable for subsequent reference. So first of all, the law here is a law, a broad notion. So it can be statute, it can be a regulation, it can be precedent, it can be also agreement of the parties. And then the concept of accessible to be usable. It means that it is possible to read the file, usually with a machine, not necessarily by a human, and to find out what kind of information is on it. So if the file is corrupt, if the support is lost, if the software is outdated and it's not possible to read that information anymore, this standard is not met. But on the other hand, this standard is only about writing. So it's only about the information. It's not about the origin of the information or about the integrity of the information. Origin has to do with the signature. Who was the creator of the message? And integrity has to do with the notion of original. So you see it here, Article 8 of the Model on Electronic Commerce. When we want to satisfy the form requirement of original, we need to have a reliable assurance on the integrity of the information from the time it was first generated in its final form. So this is additional, and it's not included in the notion of writing. The third principle is technology neutrality. Technology neutrality has to do with equal treatment of the different technologies and methods. Why? We want the law not to mandate or favor the use of any specific technology, method, or product to make it future-proof, to promote technological innovation. Because if we don't give legal recognition to new products, to recent development, we may actually stifle that innovation. We may miss out on opportunities. In practice, it does happen that certain implementing regulations may get down to the detail of certain technology requirements, but this is always very, very dangerous. It can create also problems of data silos. It can create problems of being captured by certain products or certain vendors. So this can become really something that has to be handled with a lot of caution. The issue is particularly relevant when it comes to electronic signatures that use public key infrastructure, so PKI, which is based on encryption. Normally, these are considered with higher security, although it has to be seen, of course, in the context. But at the same time, there are also some costs associated with this. So one has to see in practice, in each case, whether the use of PKI is justified under the circumstances or not. Usually, technology-neutral provisions are not explicit because the whole law is technology neutral by not doing something rather than doing something. So by not requiring or mandating the use of certain technologies or methods. But sometimes we see also some positive formulations of this principle. For instance, Article 3 of the Model on Electronic Signatures, also for the concerns which were expressed before with respect to favor for PKI-based signatures. It says that nothing in the model law shall be applied to exclude, restrict, or deprive of legal effect any method of creating an electronic signatures that satisfies the requirements of the law, which are, of course, described in technology-neutral terms. So here it clearly says all technologies, all methods, or products that may satisfy those requirements, they may have the same legal effect. Last but not least, the principle of party autonomy. And here the parties, especially business parties, are free to decide whether to use or not electronic communications and to choose the appropriate technology and security level. So we may decide that only a certain type of communication channel with a certain type of technical standards is considered reliable, or we may decide that on the other hand, any form of electronic communication, so email, instant messaging, voice messages, and so on and so forth, SMS, all can be accepted. Now, a little bit of discussion on electronic signatures. And first of all, maybe to provide a little bit of background. Electronic signatures are not a new issue. The first reported decision in the United States is from 1869, so it's more than 150 years ago. And it's in its own way, it is not different from the electronic signatures we deal with now. It was basically a matter of signing a document remotely through telex. But there is also a little bit of confusion when it comes to the use of the word electronic signatures. So in some cases, electronic signatures are considered as a trust service, that is to say, an online service that gives assurance of quality of data. In this case, the electronic signatures is giving assurance of the origin and of the integrity of the data. In other cases, we look at electronic signatures as the functional equivalent of handwritten signatures. So we are there satisfying a contract law form requirement. In some cases, again, but this is a technical meaning, we talk about signing in an electronic signature as a method to access an IT system. For instance, I sign into my email, I sign into my computer. This is not a legal use, but it is important to bear it in mind because there may be sometimes confusion. And electronic signatures have also different levels of reliability, like all trust services. And often the reference is made to so-called authentication factors. So one has to use multiple authentication factors in order to have a more secure electronic signature. These authentication factors can be something that one has, like for instance, a token with a number generator, random number generator, or a mobile phone, something that someone knows, like a password, or even what someone is, like a biometric, like for instance, a fingerprint. Now going back to the notion of functional equivalence. The issue is what is pursued with the handwritten signatures. Handwritten signatures provide some information on the origin of a document. The signature is a method, and the quality is called authenticity, that is to say, whether that document really comes from a certain person or not. So by using a signature, but in some cultures by using a seal, a personal seal, we can identify a person. We can associate that person with the content of a document. Now here, association can be different. For instance, maybe the signatory wants to be bound by a contract. Maybe the signatory is just making a statement for future reference and wants to say, I am declaring now this information. We even have attendance sheets, for instance, where the function is just to prove the physical presence of someone at a given place and time. Sometimes we get sufficient information from the paper document itself about the signatory, but sometimes we don't. And we may need additional information. For instance, in some cases, it's not enough to sign. One has to be identified with an official document, with a picture, and with maybe even a sample of the signature. So it's not that handwritten signatures in themselves are the only or the ideal solution to all the problems. If we look at how to transpose these signatures online, then the rule that we have in UNCITRAL says that whenever the law requires a signature, that a requirement is met if a method is used to identify the signatory and to indicate the intent with respect to the information contained in the data message. Now, we also require that this method is reliable, not just reliable in abstract, but reliable as appropriate for the purpose for which the data message was generated or communicated, in light of the various circumstances, but also of the agreement between the relevant parties, if there is one. And this issue of the reliability of the method is now used for all trust services, and we will see it more in detail. We have options now. We cannot discuss the details of the law, but it's important to understand the options. Because of issues of legal predictability, sometimes the law wants to favor the use of certain technologies or services, but that, of course, goes to the detriment of technology neutrality, goes to the detriment of the flexibility of the parties in choosing the kind of solution that is more appropriate for them. And it can also hinder interoperability, and at times it can also entail additional cost. So this has to be done very carefully. The over-regulation is, of course, a danger. Under-regulation, it's also a danger, because if there is not enough legal guidance, then the parties may not be sufficiently confident in migrating to online transactions. When it comes to electronic signatures, we have the so-called minimalist approach, which is the one adopted in certain UNCITRAL texts as the standard that is acceptable to everyone. So here the law sets minimum requirements for functional equivalence, was what we just saw. And the parties are absolutely free to choose the technology and method that they prefer. And of course, this is fully technology neutral. But there is limited guidance on which methods and technologies are appropriate for that transaction. It is entirely up to the parties to decide. The opposite of that is the technology-specific approach. And here, the law mandates the use of a certain technology. We have seen examples of that with respect to these digital signatures that are based on PKI cryptography. So that means that only that specific type of signature will be recognized, and all the other signatures, regardless of how often they're actually used, will not have legal recognition and legal status. Of course, this creates problems. It's not technology neutral, it's not future-proof, it does not help interoperability, and in itself, it is not recommended, and it has not given good proof of itself. It was not conducive of digital trade. What now is, however, prevailing is a compromise between the two positions, the so-called two-tier approach. The parties to the transaction are still free to choose the method they prefer. But if they choose a simple electronic signature, they would, for instance, have the burden of proof, of giving evidence that the signature is reliable. If, on the other hand, they prefer to have one of those signatures that meet additional requirements, then they could benefit from legal presumptions and additional legal predictability. That brings us exactly to these two different approaches on the assessment of reliability of an electronic signatures. The so-called ex-ante, or approach before the use. So here we have some requirements. For instance, in Article 6, Paragraph 3 of the model on electronic signatures, you see on the screen these are technology neutral, but of course they describe what the electronic signature should do from a technical perspective. And it is also possible that an entity, an authority, will determine already which services comply with these requirements. And so by using these designated services, it will be possible actually to have confidence on the legal effect because of the legal presumptions, on the fact that this is a reliable method, and it will be upheld under the law. Similar approach to this ex-ante can be found in the EU EIDAS regulation, but actually both the model on electronic signatures and the EIDAS regulation have both ex-ante, but also residually the ex post, which is the one that takes place only in case of actual dispute and after the use. Of course, here the problem is that we do not know beforehand if the method is actually reliable. There is some guidance also in UNCITRAL text with elements like the type of the transaction, the sophistication of the parties, and so on and so forth. And also, because of party autonomy, between themselves, parties can decide that something is reliable, but that, of course, does not affect third parties. So here we have maximum flexibility, maximum efficiency, but maybe not as much legal predictability and certainty as we have in the ex-ante. And of course, the two approaches may be and are combined also in UNCITRAL text. Last but not least, we have, of course, also options for the certification and trust service providers. Here, the range is from the free market approach, where everyone is able to provide services and does not need to have any license. Of course, this promotes innovation and competition, but then it is possible sometimes to provide guidance also to users by having voluntary accreditation schemes. So certain service providers may decide to voluntarily get accreditation. Or even if there is a desire to increase the level of regulation from the government, there could be mandatory licensing schemes, so that the various providers would have to apply for a license, and otherwise they cannot provide services. Now, This can be true for all kinds of services, or can also be true only for those services that are considered as more secure or qualified, and therefore they benefit for certain presumptions. And last but not least, in certain cases, we do have actually a mandatory scheme with a monopoly, and only certain authorized bodies can provide these services. Now, coming to the role of UNCITRAL and the digital trade law. UNCITRAL is the core legal body in the United Nations for commercial law. In particular, it promotes the harmonization of international trade law, but also its modernization. And sometimes the modernization impacts also national law, not necessarily only international. It produces treaties, model laws, other legislative texts, but also guidance texts, and has been established in 1966, so it has more than 50 years of work. UNCITRAL started working on what it is called electronic commerce traditionally, but it's really digital trade already in the 1980s, dealing with electronic data interchange and cross-border electronic payments. It is important to note that UNCITRAL texts on e-commerce have been enacted altogether in more than 100 states. That means that not all the texts have been enacted in all 100 states, as you can see, but the different texts have been enacted in different states, and altogether there are more than 100. All these 5 main texts that we will see now, and with explanatory notes, with their current status, with the preparatory materials, all of this information is available on the UNCITRAL website in the 6 official languages of the United Nations. So you have a really significant amount of knowledge available. The first text and the foundational one is the model on electronic commerce, which was meant, of course, to enable, to give legal recognition to electronic communication. So here we have, of course, the first formulation of the fundamental principles that I mentioned before, and also the first formulation of the rules on contracts in electronic form. This is still valid and has been adopted in more than 80 states. We have the model law on electronic signatures. UNCITRAL felt immediately after the end of the work on the model on electronic commerce to build on the provision on electronic signatures that is in the model law on electronic commerce, and which has a minimalist ex-post approach, and to complement that with the ex-ante approach and the 2-tier approach. So you have it formulated for the first time in this model law. And you have also here the obligations of the relevant parties, such as the signatory, the relying party, and the trusted third parties that intervene in the signature process. Immediately after that, UNCITRAL felt that it was necessary to complete that suite at the international level. So adopted the United Nations Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications in International Contracts, which to this day is the only treaty specifically on electronic communications. Very important, it contains rules on functional equivalence, it contains rules on contracts in electronic form, but especially because it is a treaty, it can complement other treaties, very popular treaties, such as the Convention on the Recognition and Enforcement of Foreign Arbitral Awards of 1958, the New York Convention, which has 170 states parties, or the United Nations Convention on Contracts for the International Sale of Goods, CSG of 1980, which has 95 states parties. These are incredibly useful, incredibly popular treaties. They have form requirements, and these treaties, because they have been drafted some time ago, they don't give guidance on how to satisfy the form requirements with the use of electronic means. But this Convention on Electronic Communications, it operates as an add-on. It completes and complements those treaties. And so it gives the possibility of satisfying those 4 requirements with the use of functional equivalence rules, like the ones we have just seen now. After a break, the Commission restarted work, in particular on a special type of commercial documents, which is really important, but which poses special problems. These are transferable documents or instruments. They incorporate in a paper-based document the right to payment of money or to delivery of goods. So you have here bills of lading, promissory notes, warehouse receipts, checks. Here the challenge was to carve out functional equivalence requirements for the physical possession of the paper-based document, which has been done with notions such as singularity and control. These documents, because of the challenges they pose, they have always been seen as a stumbling block. And so by removing that stumbling block, this model is really seen as a key enabler of digital trade financing, logistics, and paperless trade. It is also quite modern, as it takes into account certain technological developments, such as dynamic information generated by objects, or the use of distributed ledger technologies such as blockchain. And last but not least, in July 2022, the Commission adopted the model law on the use and cross-border recognition of identity management and trust services, which are fundamental to build trust in online transactions and in data flows. Of course, identity management is about physical and legal persons. Trust services is about assuring the quality of data. There is experience at the national level, but and also at the regional level, but there is not yet, before this model law, a text that addresses the matters at the global level. So this is the first global text. It adopts a two-tier approach with a designation of reliable services ex ante, but also the possibility of determination ex post. It is also based on geographic neutrality to promote cross-border recognition, and it does provide also guidance on the obligations, especially of the service providers and the associated liability. Now, to conclude, some words on the interaction between digital economy law and free trade agreements. Increasingly, bilateral and plurilateral free trade agreements contain chapters on e-commerce and paperless trade facilitation, sometimes called customs. If we wanted to see a complete restatement of where we stand on this matter, we can look at the e-commerce chapters of the CPTPP and the RCEP. The first one, of course, applies to Asia Pacific. The second one is mostly about East Asia and the Pacific. Of course, some countries are a party to both, and so there is a certain overlap between these provisions. But either treaty contains a quite extensive and detailed overview of what is relevant to promote digital trade in free trade agreements in the, currently. We have also dedicated treaties. Here we have, for instance, WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, which apparently only promotes electronic single windows, but in reality, in practice, had a very big impact, not only on electronic single windows, but more generally on paperless trade and digital trade. Then we have specific agreements. One is from Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific of the United Nations, the Framework Agreement on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation. Again, a treaty that is based on legal, technical considerations, but also on capacity building. We have the Digital Economy Agreements, or Digital Economy Partnership Agreements, also called, promoted by Singapore and concluded with a number of countries like Australia, New Zealand, Chile, United Kingdom. It's now discussions with South Korea, with Canada, with China. These are very detailed, and they can be seen as implementing the provision of CPTPP and RCEP, and in fact, Singapore can be a member of both of these regional agreements. So we go to another level of detail, and in that level of detail, we can see how it comes together with ancillary text. Because there is really, when the implementation, the next level is the enactment of ancillary text. And then, of course, we have in the framework of the WTO, the ongoing discussions related to the joint statement initiative and a possible plurilateral agreement. These free trade agreements or regional trade agreements can interact with ancillary text in three ways. First of all, there can be a direct reference. That is to say, there can be, like there is in CPTPP and RCEP, an obligation for the state party to the trade agreement to adopt or maintain legislation based on ancillary texts, like the model on electronic commerce or the Convention on the Use of Electronic Communications. Secondly, there could be even the provision itself of the trade agreement that repeats an ancillary provision. For instance, provisions on the legal recognition of electronic communications and electronic signatures. These are the ones on non-discrimination. We can read those provisions in the text itself of the trade agreement, and in that case, of course, they are directly binding on the parties. They don't even need to be enacted. And finally, it is possible that the trade agreement will make reference to principles that call for the adoption of ancillary text for their implementation. For instance, this Article 5 of the Framework Agreement on Cross-Border Paperless Trade Facilitation in Asia and the Pacific refers to technology neutrality, functional equivalence, and non-discrimination as founding principles. And then, of course, that implementation is much easier through the adoption of ancillary texts. I hope that you found this presentation interesting. And again, I invite you to visit the Ancillary website for additional information. Thank you very much and goodbye.